The NBA recently finished its 2016-2017 season, and we are already midway through the first round of the playoffs. I thought it would be interesting to go back and check out this interactive graph from 538 that tracks the ELO rating for an NBA team on a game-by-game basis. So 538 published this graphic 2 years ago, on May 21st, 2015, but they're still updating it to this day. So it is still relevant to use to see how an NBA team's ELO rating changed over the course of a season. For those of you who are not familiar with the ELO rating, it is a widely used rating system, but is now used in popular online multiplayer games to handle player matchmaking. Players, or in this case teams, have a numerical rating that increases or decreases based on the outcomes of the games. The winner takes points away from the loser, and the difference between the ratings determine the amount of points gained or lost. When a higher rated player wins, few points are awarded since it was expected. But if there is an upset where a lower rated player wins against a higher rated player, the amount of points exchanged is a lot greater. The rating system is then self-correcting in that the rating becomes more accurate over a course of many games. So 538 adopted this ELO rating and applied it to NBA games, and they did it over the entire history of the NBA, so you can kind of see how the ELO rating changes across over a season and over the course of the NBA's history. I'm going to be going through each team for this past 2016-2017 season and see how their ELO rating changed over the course of a season. This video is going to go over teams in the Eastern Conference. The next video is going to go over teams in the Western Conference. And we're going to go in alphabetical order. So we're first going to start off with Atlanta. So you can see they first start out with pretty high ELO rating, which is based on last season. They ended around 1600, so they start around there. They have a big dip, and I looked into it, and you'll see Atlanta starts out with a pretty big dip from November down to December, and taking a closer look, that's when they had a significant road trip, and they went through a lot of losses. And then they floated around average at 1500, and then had a bit of a dip towards the end. They traded Kyle Korver on January 7th, but it looks like that didn't make too much of an impact on their rating. But over in March, you see their rating drops down pretty significantly, but it catches up at the end of the season. This drop is after playing some quality playoff teams, but they pick it off towards the end of the season where they beat Cleveland twice. And they finish off the season right at around 1500. So now we move on to Boston, which had a pretty consistent season. When we look at their ELO rating, it's pretty much close to around 1600. They ended up with the number 1 seed. And even though it's not their ELO rating, it's fairly low for a number 1 seed. You'll see later why that is. The Cavs have a pretty significant downward trend towards the latter half of the season. So since the Cavs were going down and Boston is able to keep their consistent rating, that's probably how they ended up with the first seed. You can also see that the Celtics rating is pretty similar to last year's rating. They also were hovering around 1600 towards the latter half of the previous season. It looks like they picked right where they left off. So the Nets trends look pretty bad, even looking at the previous season. They've been on a constant downward trend, and they seem to continue that for most of the season. But at the very end of the season, post All-Star break, they've had a consistently upward trend and ended up at around 1400. During this trend is also when Jeremy Lin was kind of playing more consistently. He was injured throughout most of the season, and post All-Star break was when he was back to playing. So he was starting all the games, and looks like that kind of contributed to moving their rating a bit higher. So the Hornets season started off pretty well. They were their rating was above average, but towards the middle of the season, the Hornets had a road trip around the end of January, 5-game road trip, and all of them were losses, and that's why you see this big downward trend, and they've kind of been stuck right below the average for the remaining of the season. So the Bulls, they started out with a below average ELO rating. They had a pretty poor finish the previous season. And this is the first season with Dwayne Wade, so there's a bit of an adjustment period. They had a strong start, so that got them up in the 1540 rating. And then they dropped back down. They've had a pretty tumultuous season with a lot of drama going on, but it looks like towards the end of the season they pick it up. And during this late season surge, Dwayne Wade wasn't playing. Maybe that had something to do with it, but overall nothing really sticks out besides the late season upward trend. So the defending champs, the Cavaliers, they started out with a pretty high ELO rating since they finished off last season with the championship, and they ended up around 1760. So they were starting out with a high rating, but as you can see, they've been consistently trending downwards across the season. There was a bit of an upward trend leading up to Kevin Love's injury, and after that, they continued this downward trend. So looking at this, it's a bit worrying since the Cavs performed really badly over the course of a season. Last season, they were consistently around 1650, and they were kind of able to maintain that, but once Kevin Love had his injury during the middle of February, they've been trending downwards. So if Kevin Love hadn't been injured, maybe they could have stuck around 1650. So the Pistons during the previous season, during the 2015-2016 season, they were pretty consistent around 1500, about the league average. And that's where they start out this 16-17 season. You'll see a big spike towards the early part of the season. They won 3 straight road games against the Hornets, the Celtics, and the Hawks. The Hornets and the Hawks also had a high ELO rating at the beginning of the season. So that's why you see this really big spike for the Pistons. But they drop back down to earth, back at around the average. And then towards the end of the season, they drop off pretty significantly. I tried to do some digging, and I didn't see what exactly was going wrong with the Pistons at the end of the season. One thing I noticed, though, was that Andre Drummond had a pretty poor performance. Another explanation may be that they were trying to tank to get a better draft pick. The Pacers season is pretty uneventful. They hovered around 1500, right around the average. And towards the end of the season, you see they beat some quality teams. So that's why their rating ends up a bit higher in the 1526. The Miami Heat's chart is probably the most interesting one out of the Eastern Conference. They start out with a pretty high rating due to last year they finished off with a pretty good season. But not surprisingly, with the loss of Dwayne Wade, their rating would go down a bit, and you would expect to fall around the average, but it keeps going down, and they go all the way down to 1412, which is pretty bad. But from here, the rating is constantly increasing, and they end up at a similar point to where they started out in the beginning of the season. This season can be best explained by looking at Dion Waiters' performance. He was actually starting games for the Heat at the beginning of the season, but around December is when he was not starting games anymore and wasn't getting any playing time. And then they put him back in the starting lineup around this time, And that's when Dion's scoring really picked up, and that provided the Heat with enough offense that really helped bring their rating back up. They barely missed the playoffs. Dion Waiters also was injured around this time, and that's why the rating slips a bit. Unfortunately, they missed the playoffs, but it would have been interesting because if they kept Dion Waiters in the starting lineup, maybe they wouldn't have had gone through such a dip in their performance. The Bucks, they started around 1400 and they were able to get their rating up right around the league average. And then Jabari Parker had an injury around this time, and that's probably why their rating slipped a bit. But then they're able to get it back up above 1500, and kind of similar to the Dion Waiters situation, but Malcolm Brogdon, once he was actually starting games earlier in the season, and then was put on the bench during the middle, but he became the starting point guard towards the end of the season, and that kind of coincides with the high rating that they finished off at the end. The next season is pretty uneventful as well. They were consistently bad across the season and finished below 1400. Nothing really sticks out for the next season. Similar to the Knicks, the Magic also were pretty consistently bad and hovered around 1400 and finally ended up around 1350. So both the Knicks and the Magic are in pretty bad shape, had a pretty dismal season. So charts like these, fans of the Magic and the Knicks should stay away from. The 76ers season is pretty interesting. They started with a really low rating due to how they performed last season. And they kind of have an upward trend. This was during the time when Embiid was healthy. Unfortunately, Embiid gets injured and is shut down for the rest of the season. That happens around mid-January. But surprisingly, they don't go back down to... you don't see a downward trend post-Embiid injury. That might be due to the fact that their rating just started out so low, and when they actually should have been around 1400. But in the end, they end up with a very low rating, obviously for tanking reasons. The Raptors had a pretty strong start to the season up until end of December, but they have a big drop here during January. They dropped by like 50 points over the course of 2 games. It's a blowout against the Hornets and a loss against the Suns. So that's one thing I noticed about the ELO rating, where you can have really significant changes based on 1 or 2 games. But after that, the rest of the season is pretty stable, and they end up with a pretty good rating at 1600. Kevin Lowry got injured towards the end of the season, but it looks like they're not trending upwards, but they were able to keep a stable rating during that time. And that's probably because they added PJ Tucker and Serge Ibaka towards the end of the season. That kept them at a pretty good rating. And finally, we'll end with the Washington Wizards. The previous season, they were hovering around 1500 at the average, and that's where they start during the 16-17 season. And they kind of exhibit the same behavior as the previous season, just hovering around 1500. And right around January is when they increased their rating all the way up to 1600, and they're able to keep it there and finish off with a pretty good rating at the end of the season. This is the season when Scotty Brooks replaced Randy Whitman, and I guess during the first part of the season is when they were going through adjustments, and I guess they figured out a pretty good lineup. They had a significant trade with the Nets during the middle of the season for Bojanovic, and maybe that's also contributes to a pretty good rating to finish off. So that's it for the Eastern Conference. Please tune in to my next video where I will go over and do the same thing but for the Western Conference teams.